I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after Ukraine claims to have destroyed a litany of Russian aircraft over the weekend, we discuss war crimes described on Russian state television committed against Ukrainian snipers, and claims that Moscow is using nuns as spies to spread propaganda.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 30th of June, 3 years and 127 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. First, though, over to Dom for the latest from the battlefront.
Thanks, Francis. Let's start, in the air, but we'll go back chronologically over the weekend. So on Friday, Ukrainian drones struck 4 Su-34 fighter jets at the Mariupol airfield in Russia's Volgograd Oblast. That's about 200 kilometres east of the furthest eastmost part of Ukraine, the bit that's currently occupied, but well beyond Ukrainian lines at the moment. This comes from Ukraine's military reporting over the weekend. It's thought that of those 4 jets, 2 were totally destroyed, 2 damaged. Damaged in this context may well be very serious as well if they can't cannibalise parts from other aircraft to fix them or have enough coming through the production lines. But certainly they're saying 2 were totally destroyed. Now, Ukraine's general staff said the attack also caused a fire at the airfield's technical and operational unit. That's a facility where the combat jets are serviced and repaired. Then on Saturday night, drones said to be operated by the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, hit the Kirovsky military airfield in occupied Crimea. This is a source in the SBU speaking to the Kyiv Independent reporting this. Now, that attack is said to have destroyed 3 helicopters, an Mi-8 HIP, that's a kind of medium lift, quite old, but produced in its thousands, tens of thousands, a medium lift aircraft, an Mi-26 Halo, or NATO codename Halo. That's a heavy transport aircraft, a massive aircraft. Think of a large fixed wing transport plane. Take the wings off, stick rotors on. That's kind of what a Halo is. It's absolutely enormous. And also an Mi-28 attack helicopter known as Havoc by NATO. They also say they destroyed a Pantsir S-1 self-propelled anti-aircraft missile and associated gun system for that. Now, Ukraine's General Staff update today says that these numbers take the total of lost aircraft for Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion to 420 fixed-wing and 340 helicopters. I mean, the scale is just staggering, the scale of the losses and the scale of the inventory to have those losses taken from. A salutary note there, I think, for NATO. They also said Russia lost 1,070 military personnel yesterday. But just staggering numbers. Now then, continuing through the weekend, overnight Saturday, Sunday saw the largest combined series of strikes of the war so far from Russia. They launched 537 missiles and drones against Ukraine, including 447 Shaheds and associated decoys. Also 4 Kinzhal missiles, 7 Iskander-M or KN-23 ballistic missiles, KN-23 being the North Korean variant, as well as 41 KH-101 or Iskander-K cruise missiles from a number of oblasts in Russia, 5 Caliber cruise missiles from the Black Sea, and 3 S-300 air defence missiles from Kursk Oblast. Now, of those, so 447 drones, as I said, 221 were shot down, a further 225 brought down by electronic warfare or lost to radar, returned to sender. Also shot down was 1 of the 7 Iskander-M/KN-23 ballistic missiles, 33 of the 41 KH-101 Iskander-K cruise missiles, another one of those lost by EW or just lost to radar. 4 of the 5 Caliber cruise missiles as well. So a reasonable shoot down, but if some of these things are getting through, as in 7 KH-101 or Iskander-K cruise missiles get through, it's going to cause a lot of damage, as we know. Now, you may have seen reports over the weekend that on Saturday night, a Ukrainian F-16 fighter pilot died while repelling the strikes. The jet was lost as part of that, the effort to repel those munitions. Now, Kyiv City Military Administration head Timur Tkachenko, he said Russia has changed its tactics recently in order to inflict as much damage to civilian areas as possible. He said Russian missile and drone strikes against his city alone, Kyiv alone, this month they've been hit three times with 285 drones and 65 missiles. For comparison, he said that January saw Kyiv hit by 35 drones and 1 ballistic missile, so a massive uptick in the last couple of months. Mr. Tkachenko said that 42 civilians have been killed and 234 injured this month alone in Kyiv. So this month alone and in Kyiv alone. So Russia really has ticked up the attacks because, as I've said before, that's all they're capable of doing right now. It's the air campaign, and it's not much of a campaign, just whacking munitions into civilian areas. That's all they're capable of doing. They're not knitting these things together as part of an air-land battle, coordinated battle, anything like that. They are just attempting to kill as many civilians as possible. Last night, for example, attacks across the country killed another 6, injured nearly 30. The deaths were in Kharkiv and mainly across the south, around Kherson, Zaporizhia, and also the Donbass. 74 of 107 drones were shot down yesterday. Now then, in Sumy Oblast yesterday, Russian attacks injured 3 civilians. This comes from regional authorities this morning. But just to give you a flavour, they say nearly 80 strikes targeted 29 settlements, damaging houses, educational institutions and public buildings. But for all that, for all the air and the munitions I've just said there against Sumy yesterday, there's been next to no movement on the ground. I know I've been saying that a lot recently, but it brings it home to me when I've been away for a few days. I wasn't on the pod last Thursday or Friday, so I came back this morning to get a good dial back in, and actually, you know what? Absolutely, virtually nothing. Virtually no movement on the ground, and certainly nothing north of Sumy. There's been a small Russian advance southwest of Pokrovsk. They're still trying to run along the border between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast there, but next to no movement at all. It's just the air, and it's just a campaign of terror, basically, against the civilian population. Also last night, though, the Kerch Bridge was temporarily closed following reports of explosions and active air defence in the city of Kerch. This comes from local Telegram channels. Kyiv Independent today citing the Crimean Wind Telegram channel as saying, explosions heard in Kerch, Russian air defence is firing, the lighting on the Crimean bridge has been turned off. We believe traffic was halted and has resumed just over an hour after it was first stopped. A couple more from me. Worth pointing out, Christopher Miller, the Financial Times' chief correspondent in Kyiv, says that Poland is going to boost production of howitzer, so heavy artillery ammunition, 5-fold. Poland's State Assets Minister told the Financial Times' Central European correspondent Rafael Menda that the state defence group PGZ will, in the coming days, receive 2.4 billion zlotys, that's about $663 million worth, of government funds to increase output of 155 and 120mm shells, 155 being the heavy artillery, 120 being, well, it can be mortars or tanks. And just finally for me, Ukraine's Defence Ministry said they have approved the domestically made ground-based robot, the Muraka, which stands for, or translates as ANT, approved for combat operations. The ministry said this on Saturday. Now, the Muraka can reportedly carry over half a ton of weight across dozens of kilometres, we are told, able to cross difficult terrain and can wade a little bit, go through a bit of shallow water. Now, I'm going to offer more thoughts on unattended ground vehicles, ground drones, robots, whatever we're going to call them, in final thoughts, because I think this is likely to be the next big area of innovation. If you see what's happened to drones in the air in the last couple of years, I think the same is about to happen on the ground, but I'll save those for later. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Last week we described how from Lapland in the high north of Finland to Lublin province in eastern Poland, a new and explosive Iron Curtain is about to descend across Europe in the forms of millions of landmines, following many countries' withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention. So I'll start today with the news that President Zelensky has signed a decree to do the same, saying as follows: Russia has never been a party to this convention and uses anti-personnel mines extremely cynically. And not only now in the war against Ukraine. This is the signature style of Russian killers, to destroy life by all methods at their disposal. So for context, Ukraine is already the most heavily mined country in the world, with both sides laying them at various phases of the war. The majority are believed to be Russian, but President Biden actually did send some anti-personnel mines at one phase. So we shouldn't expect this to lead to a major shift in Ukraine's use of anti-personnel mines, this withdrawal. Rather, I think we should see it as a symbol that Kyiv is following the same course as those NATO countries who feel threatened and have taken the step to formally leave. And for more analysis on that, do check out last week's episodes where we talked about it at length, including with David Blair, who wrote a fascinating piece on this subject for The Telegraph. Staying with Kyiv, the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament, Ruslan Stefanchuk, said on Saturday that Ukraine's parliament is preparing a draft bill to hold elections following the end of the martial law period enacted as a result of the war. Now, I should stress that there's no expectation that will end anytime soon, but he said this: "We are working on this draft law because for the next elections a new special draft law is needed that will regulate the so-called post-war elections. We are preparing various basic scenarios so that people can exercise their fundamental constitutional right to vote, and this must take place in Ukraine, and I believe we will be able to find the right legislative compromise." As I say, no sign this will happen anytime soon. The majority of opposition figures have acknowledged elections cannot take place until at the very least a secure ceasefire occurs. But this is an interesting step, and I think it is worthy of note. Another interesting step is taking place in Congress in the United States. After holding a discussion with Donald Trump, Senator Lindsey Graham announced yesterday that the president was ready for the Senate to vote on that bill to impose new sanctions on Russia and countries purchasing their oil and gas. Now, it's expected the vote will take place following the end of the July congressional break. Graham told ABC News, "For the first time, the president has told me it is time to move your bill. I think we're in good shape, but he has a waiver. It's up to him how to impose it." Now, we don't know the full details of that waiver, nor whether there is an expectation that this will ultimately be just a political gesture by the Senate, if it passes, which would make it easier for Trump to theoretically take steps to put economic pressure on Moscow by saying it was the will of Congress. The last we heard, lest we forget, the White House was unhappy with how strong the bill was worded and compelling its authors, including Mr. Graham, to tone it down. So we will have to see. But nonetheless, some progress on that bill that I know many of you are monitoring closely. Just as a side tangent, while we're on the subject of Washington, the director of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service told Russian state media yesterday that he has agreed to remain in open contact with the CIA's director, John Ratcliffe, following a recent phone call between the two. He said, "I had a phone call with my American counterpart and we reserved for each other the possibility of a call to each other at any time and to discuss issues of interest to us." So that incarnation of the red telephone is still functioning. Moving on to Russia and its allies next. There have already been reports previously that Russian forces tend to execute captured Ukrainian snipers rather than take them prisoner. That was something that was indeed even confirmed on Russian state TV's flagship weekly news programme some time ago. But over the weekend, we learned of another war crime from Russian state television, where they were speaking to a Russian soldier on Rossiya 1. That's one of Russia's two main TV stations. While we were in Odessa, that channel actually rather disparagingly shared a photo of the panel I moderated at the forum, the one you will have heard on Tuesday. But in this interview, the soldier says if Ukrainian snipers were taken prisoner, 2 fingers would be cut off on the right and left hands so they can't shoot again. Suffice to say, that is a direct violation of international law and the Geneva Convention. And I'll come back to the subject of such violations later in the episode. Not that any of these well-recorded cases seem to matter to certain countries. Slovakia's foreign minister has suggested that the international community may need to forgive Russia's actions to end the war. That comes after Slovakia requested that the adoption of the 18th package of EU sanctions against Russia be postponed until a decision is made on the consequences for the member states of the European Commission's initiative to end dependence on Russian fossil fuels by 2030. The foreign minister, speaking to domestic media, said the ongoing war cannot be resolved on the battlefield and stressed the importance of diplomacy and international law, if you can believe it. Let us return to the respect for international law and seek ways to communicate with the Russian Federation, he said, and perhaps even forgive everything that has happened. More information has also come out about the political detainees recently freed from Belarus, another key Moscow ally at the present moment, including prisoner Sergei Tikhanovsky, who, according to an interview with him by the BBC, had barely spoken for more than 5 years. As the piece relays from this very important figure in Belarusian resistance to Lukashenko, when asked about the reunion with his family, Sergei lifts a hand to his face and weeps. His daughter was only 4 when he was arrested. She didn't recognise me, he manages eventually. Then she threw herself into my arms and we hugged for a long time. Sergei's transformation since his arrest is shocking. Back in 2020, he was stocky and bearded. Now the face is gaunt. He says he's lost almost 60 kilograms in jail, where he spent endless weeks in punishment cells. Physically, I'm half the size and half the weight, he says, but my spirit is not broken. Maybe it's even stronger. Before, I'd only heard of the crimes of this regime, but now I've seen them firsthand, and we have to fight that. We'll link to that piece with a very important figure, as I say, in the Belarusian opposition in the show notes. I'll return to violations of international law later in the episode, but first, let's stick with Europe and turn to Germany next, and our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell.
Hello, Francis. Well, as you're no doubt aware, and many of our readers are probably aware as well, the German car industry used to be the absolute pride of the country, the apple in its eye. But recently, very disappointing sales, particularly on electric car sales, and incredibly tough competition from China and a whole load of other economic factors have led to an unprecedented crisis for this once proud, if you'll excuse the appalling pun, motor of the German economy. We're looking at potentially factory closures happening in the German car industry. There's been quite a large number of layoffs as well, and even larger amounts of layoffs projected in future. And there has been, Francis, and this brings us to the connection with the war, a rather surprising knight in shining armour, which you could say is riding to the rescue of Germany's car industry. And that's its defence industry. As you know, Francis, there is a big rearmament policy underway in Germany under Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor. He wants to make the German army the strongest in Europe. He wants to, in fact, he already has lifted debt limits in the German political system, which allows potentially unlimited spending on military projects. So we're talking about a chancellor that wants to massively increase the number of tanks that are being produced. He wants to increase the size of his army. He wants to increase production of key weapons that can be used by the German military or by its allies. And the German defence industry has realised that it can turn that decline of the German car industry to its great advantage. I've spoken to insiders in the German defence industry who say that there are a lot of transferable skills here, and that sources in the German defence industry are now actively looking to pick up engineers who've lost their jobs in the German car industry so that they can be flipped around and put to welding or building or developing tanks instead. And we're not just talking about basic skills here like welding. We're talking about some very advanced electronic skills that relate to, for example, the motion sensors that are being installed in civilian cars, but can also have a military use as well. So it's this really interesting story that's not just about how the decline of one industry in Germany, cars, is potentially going to serve the benefits of another. It's a story about a very profound societal change in Germany as well as economic. This is a country that really doesn't like its defence industry for obvious historical reasons that relate to deep-seated guilt over the wartime period of the mid-20th century. It's a country that for so long was incredibly proud of its car industry. This was considered to be perhaps the biggest success of its post-war story. And now the hated defence industry appears to be, based on the sources that I've spoken to, riding to the rescue of that car industry and taking people who have lost their jobs, may lose their jobs making cars, and essentially turning them into tank producers. And very, very early signs that this is happening at the moment, Francis, but if it does, it's a very interesting example of how the security crisis in Europe has had this kind of unintended consequence, which is that it's thrown potentially a lifeline to an industry that was already under immense threat from another sort of rising rival/foe to Germany, which is, of course, China.
Thanks, James. I mean, it really is an absolutely fascinating story, and we'll link to what you've written up on it in the show notes. But even though that is extraordinary, I think the next story that you've been working on, which we were talking about last week with you, and I was very much excited to discuss with you on the podcast, is relating to Estonia. Now, we've recently done several segments on Lithuania, Latvia, Sweden, those countries that perceive themselves as being on the front line of any incalcitrant Russia. But what you've been looking at has, well, nuns at the heart of it. Where do you want to start on this one, James?
Yes. If you opened the Telegraph last week, you would have seen among many of the fascinating reads that were on offer, the headline, "Russia using nuns as spies to spread propaganda." And that's a headline of the story that I wrote last week or the week before, which is about a warning by the Estonian government that Russia is now using nuns to essentially circulate pro-Moscow propaganda narratives all over the Baltic state. And we centered for our story on this one tiny, tiny, centuries-old convent, the Pühtiste convent in eastern Estonia, not far from the Russian border, which says that it is being unfairly victimized by the Estonian government, that it's being unfairly forced to cut ties with the Russian Orthodox Church, and that it is the victim of a dire crackdown on religious freedom in Europe. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, as we all know, is run by Patriarch Kirill, who is not only overseeing a church that blesses nuclear weapons and blesses weapons that are fired on civilians in Ukrainian cities, but he's the closest supporter in the religious sphere of Vladimir Putin and of Vladimir Putin's war. So you've got this convent, which is Russian Orthodox, on the wrong side of the NATO border, deep in remote rural Estonia, which is refusing to cut ties, which is refusing to abandon or disown the Russian Orthodox Church. Inevitably, based on the security situation, the Estonian government has therefore accused the convent of refusing to cut ties with Moscow because it actually has underlying sympathies towards the war, and that it may even be being used as a kind of catspaw by Moscow, by the Russian Orthodox Church, in order to, as I said earlier, spread pro-Russian or pro-Ukraine invasion or pro-war narratives. Now, to get to the bottom of this, I interviewed the abbess of the convent, and we had a very interesting discussion. It was over Zoom, a highly unusual situation where she has, on the one hand, renounced all worldly ties, but at the same time is giving interviews to journalists over Zoom in order to speak about the intrusion, as she sees it, of the Estonian state into her private religious life. And during our interview, where it became clear, by the way, that she was a real nun, just to offset any doubts, because the headline of the story was Russian spies posing as nuns. She was a real nun, and she told what a cynic might describe as a sob story, a story of how she is a completely innocent, normal nun who's just living her quiet life in Pühtiste convent. She's just getting on with a life of quiet reflection and prayer. And it is jolly unreasonable that she's being expected to cut ties with the Patriarchate of Moscow because this is the sort of overarching governing body of their church. And we are nuns. We have nothing to do with politics. We have nothing to do with geopolitics. But it would be, she said, a form of sin. It would be the sin of schism for her to cut ties with the Moscow Patriarchate. So we had a discussion about this, and it was clear that this abbess's fear that her convent might be closed down as a result of her refusing to cut ties with Moscow could be a consequence that might be coming further down the road. Now, at this point of the story, Francis, I'd interviewed a nun who claimed that this very, very unreasonable and overbearing Estonian government was trying to undermine religious freedom. And I was struck by the similarities that this argument had not only to Russia, but also the Trump administration. J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States, very, very big vocal figure on this idea that religious freedoms are being curtailed in the rest of Europe. And so I spoke to the Estonian government and interviewed a senior official in the Estonian government's interior ministry. And that official went much further than I had expected him to go after doing that interview. And I will read out this quote from Martin Tulit, a senior Estonian government official, referring to the convent and the abbess that I had interviewed earlier in that week. This convent should be seen not simply as a religious institution, but as a symbol of the Ruski Mir ideology on Estonian soil, an ideology promoted by the Russian state and the Moscow Patriarchate that blends religion, nationalism, and imperial nostalgia. And then referring specifically to the abbess herself, this Estonian official added, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow appointed the current abbess in 2011. She has expressed narratives portraying Estonia's history through a lens that closely aligns with the official Russian position. And he cited an argument that the government had had with the nun over the chronology of the history of the convent and some of the governing bodies that the convent was part of many years ago as evidence for that. So it's a very, very strange and unusual story, a story which, you know, on the surface of things, to some eyes might have looked like a story about nuns who were being bullied by an overbearing government, but on a little bit of closer investigation appeared potentially to be something very different indeed. Now, I must stress for the purpose of this podcast that the convent and lawyers who represent the convent in the media vehemently deny that this convent is engaged in spying for Russia or for spreading pro-Russian narratives. They made that point very forcefully. The abbess made that point herself during the interview, and we received an additional comment, which we include in the story, from essentially the convent's lawyers, denying that this is the case. They stick to this narrative, as I said earlier, that they are just a bunch of pious nuns living their lives out there in the remote countryside in this beautiful convent, by the way. The pictures of it are quite stunning. But the Estonian government sees a very, very different side to this story. They see a convent which they say is spreading that pro-Moscow narrative in which the West is the true autocrat, in which it's the West which is stamping all over religious freedom and invading countries and causing problems. An anti-Western, pro-Putin narrative that's being, they claim, spread by the Russian Orthodox Church in order to subtly influence Europeans, particularly religious Europeans who might have pre-existing sympathies towards that mental image that they've got in their head of an innocent nun or an innocent monk. And so it was a dive down a particularly fascinating rabbit hole, Francis. And it's a story that I think is going to continue to run. The Estonian government, by the way, denies that it intends to shut down that convent. It will be stripped of a special legal status that it currently enjoys unless it cuts ties with the Patriarchate of Moscow. But the Estonian government insists that that would have no further impact on the convent's ability to operate in Estonia, and it cited a precedent from, I think, several decades ago where the convent also operated without that special status, and the Estonian government says it didn't have any problems. But it's a row that's going to continue to drag on, I think. And because that convent, and I'll end on this point, is so close to the border with Russia and the contested town of Narva, which is right on the Estonian-Russian border, there are concerns that this convent might potentially be cited by Russia as an example of a need to protect a victimized Russian minority living on, as I said earlier, the sort of wrong side of the NATO border. And so, as I said, on the surface of things, it's a story about nuns, bona fide nuns in a bona fide convent, living their lives, but they are from the Russian Orthodox Church, and it therefore has also become, to a great extent, an espionage story. And that, I think, is what made it so fascinating.
Well, James, this is an extraordinary story, and I think you can see why at home I was so excited really to talk about it today. James, I wanted just to comment on one thing on this, and I'll hand over to Dom, who I know also wants to speak about it and to ask you a question. there is a pattern here that I think it's not remiss for me to mention, which is that we've heard from many listeners and fellow journalists of many other monks, nuns, who seem to be rather heavily armed with lawyers and PR firms, contacting newspapers with these similar style sob stories. And it would appear, and I've heard this anecdotally, and I'm not saying that this is the case with this particular convent, but I've heard anecdotally that stories will be published by Western outlets across Europe relating to these kind of stories, even if it's just a report of the nuns or the monks saying that they're concerned that just publishing that story alone, and then that is then being taken to politicians by those with a vested interest in this war to say, look, this is what is happening in Europe, this is what is happening in Ukraine as well, and therefore you need to be very careful about supporting Ukraine because it is leading to religious censorship. Now that plays very powerfully in the United States. And as I say, I have heard from several listeners to this podcast and colleagues in the journalistic profession who know instances of this happening. And so if you're aware of similar cases to this, we would love to hear from you, because it seems that this is something that is far bigger than a mere single story that is going on in, say, one specific country, but is a trend and is a theme, with religion being used at the heart of efforts to perhaps be influencing the information space. But as I say, that's speculation on my part. But Dom, where do you want to comment on this?
Thanks, Francis. James, fascinating stuff. I've not seen that story. I will take a look. But just from your words there, I would like, if I may, for the next minute or so, to play a game with you. I would like to play Breach or Reach. Now, this is a game that you and I are going to play. I'm going to play a Russian government official. You're going to play a senior official to Estonia's Interior Ministry. And I want you to tell me, at what point has NATO Article 5 been breached, or are you just reaching for a convenient excuse? So here I go. I'm a Russian official. You're the official in the Estonian Interior Ministry. Are you ready, James, to play Breach or Reach?
I wasn't ready when I agreed to come on this podcast, but I'm definitely ready now, Dom. Hit me.
Okay, so here we go. So I'm in character now. This rambunctious report has nothing to do with any ridiculous accusation of nuns spying. This is simply about Estonia not allowing freedom of religious expression. This is an attack on culture, an attack on religion, literally an attack on peace. And I am concerned that Estonia's authorities may try to use this as an excuse to force their way into the convent, a disgraceful and aggressive act of disrespect to the nuns and an attempt at religious censorship. So I am very concerned about civil unrest happening in the vicinity of this convent, and I call on local people who feel strongly about this to protest. And I ask any local volunteers that are so minded to go to the convent today unarmed. I in no way seek any violence whatsoever, but I urge people to go to the convent unarmed, local civilians, to act to protect the convent and the nuns contained therein. James, breach or reach? Is that a breach of Article 5?
I'm going to say, based on the discussions that I had with Estonian officials for this story, that would be considered a reach.
So that's not a breach. Fine. OK, so we then fast forward a couple of days. I'm the Russian official again. Now, these civilians, they're doing a great job of putting up with this outrageous provocation, but they are disorganised, and I seek some overarching organisation. I want this group to be not a militia at all, but in some way organised to repel this disgraceful act of wanton state aggression by Estonia. James, breach or reach?
Reach.
OK, still a reach. a couple more days. I'm very concerned. Events are spiralling out of control. There has been violence at the convent. These civilians, although they're doing sterling work, they are not able to put up with the awful aggression inflicted upon them by the Estonian authorities. So I'm going to send my own Russian civilian security company across the border. These are civilians. They are nothing to do with the state apparatus, but this is a civilian company called, Group for Russia Security or something. I'm going to send this civilian security company over the border to protect the nuns in the convent.
Are they wearing green?
They might be wearing green, but they are civilians and they are unarmed. James, is that a breach of Article 5?
For Estonia, from the Estonian perspective, based on chats with Estonian officials, I would say that is a breach.
OK, so still a breach. Couple more days. Right, this security company, they're just not able to put up with the appalling aggression visited upon them. So we're going to send Russian police over, unarmed police, but uniformed members of the state apparatus, these police. They are unarmed, though, James. Breach or reach?
Way beyond the scope of the discussion that I had now with the Estonian government, but in the interest of playing along, I will say breach.
Still a reach. OK, so I've now got Russian police surrounding the convent, trying to de-escalate the situation, although there are skirmishes occasionally. We don't know who starts it, but there are occasional skirmishes, and the Russian police are unable to defend themselves and the nuns inside. So we're now going to send in paramilitary police, and they will be armed, but for their own self-protection only. They're in no way acting aggressively to the Estonian authorities, and if they just walked away, then none of this would happen. But I'm going to put armed paramilitary Russian police in with weapons for their own self-protection. James, is that a breach or reach?
A breach. I'm sure that would be considered a breach.
Right, so you're prepared to go to war. You will go to the North Atlantic Council and you will invoke Article 5 of the founding treaty of NATO with all the potential for President Donald Trump to pull out, say that's ridiculous. These are just paramilitary police with their own sidearms for their own personal protection. You're prepared to do that, are you?
I think the Estonian government, based on it being one of the most vigilant countries in NATO, would absolutely consider an incursion by armed men from Russia to be a breach, yes.
OK, no, interesting. I mean, they were police only. If you hadn't at that point and the situation had continued to deteriorate because of, little green men starting fights, then after that I would have put in regular armed forces. I just highlight how these things can so very easily be twisted in ways that you might not initially think. And you can see the arguments being rehearsed now about this is unarmed, this is perfectly legitimate, this is defending this egregious attack on culture. I think this situation in the convent, it sounds a bit of a quirky story, but I do immediately see a potential test of Article 5. So, James, thank you for playing breach or reach. I'm not sure if it really works, but I do look upon issues such as this, especially around the town of Narva in the east of Estonia. I'm particularly concerned about these potential flashpoints. But, James, thank you.
That was great. That really did underscore, actually, how murky this becomes, which, as you say, would be the deliberate policy. But James, thank you for that. We'll come back to you at the end just for your final thoughts. But just before we go to that segment, I wanted to flag two pieces, one by us in the Telegraph and one by the BBC, looking into experiences in the occupied territory, which, as you'll know, is a key focus for us on Ukraine the Latest. Ours, by James Beardsworth, describes conditions in Berdyansk, the city situated along the Azov Sea coastline, which has been turned into a ghost town since the invasion. A quote from that piece: "Those that stayed have watched the small city turn into a military outpost where plainclothes soldiers fill cafes, curfews apply, and thousands of unfamiliar faces fill the jobs and houses left behind. Of the population still there, 60 to 70% are waiting for Ukraine to return. They still do not believe and do not want to believe that Russia has come forever." The BBC's piece looks at Mariupol in response to the Russian propaganda videos we've been discussing with Dr. Jade McGlynn in the past. The one Ukrainian who speaks anonymously says this: "What they're showing on Russian TV are fairy tales for fools. Most of Mariupol still lies in ruins. They are repairing the facades of the buildings on the main streets where they bring cameras to shoot. But around the corner there is rubble and emptiness. Many people still live in half-destroyed apartments with their walls barely standing." The piece also interviews a 66-year-old woman who escaped last year. She says, "There are a lot of lies floating around. We had a beautiful city, but now it's diseased. I wouldn't say the Russian authorities, have repaired a lot of things. There's a central square, only the buildings there have been reconstructed. And there are also empty spaces where buildings stood. They cleared the debris, but they didn't even separate out the dead bodies. They just loaded onto trucks with the rubble and carried out of the city. Some have said the water there looks like Coca-Cola and that children are being taught false information and propaganda. For example, school textbooks state that Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Odessa, Crimea and even Dnipropetrovsk regions are already part of Russia. Now that is coming from testimony by Andriy, who fled after his resistance activities in Mariupol were detected. And indeed in the piece, it talks about the work of resistance in the city, which is very similar to incidents that Jade has described for us. And I'll quote again from the piece. Some Ukrainians are waging a secret resistance against Russia, and in the dead of the night, they spray paint Ukrainian blue and yellow colours on walls and also paste leaflets with messages like "Liberate Mariupol" and "Mariupol is Ukraine." But their main objective is collecting intelligence for the Ukrainian military. I document information about Russian military movements, says Andriy. I analyse where they are transporting weapons, how many soldiers are entering and leaving the city, and what equipment is being repaired in our industrial areas. I take photos secretly and keep them hidden until I can transmit them to Ukrainian intelligence through secure channels. Every day you delete your messages because your phone can be checked at checkpoints. You're afraid to call your friends in Ukraine in case your phone is being tapped, says another member of the Ukrainian resistance. A person from a neighbouring house was arrested right off the street because somebody reported that he was allegedly passing information to the Ukrainian military. Your life is like a movie, a constant tension, fear, distrust. And the piece ends with these words by another resistance member. Giving away territory for a deal with Russia will be a betrayal. Dozens risk their lives every day to pass information to Ukraine, not so that some diplomat in a suit will sign a paper that will hand us over. We don't want peace at any cost. We want liberation. So 2 very interesting long reads on subjects often underreported in the media more widely, and we'll be returning to the subject of resistance in the occupied territories in Friday's episode. So let's turn to our final thoughts now. Dom, where do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So I talked earlier today about the unattended ground vehicles. We haven't got a better phrase at the moment for ground drones. We talk about drones, everyone thinks drones in the sky, but these are ground drones, so unattended ground vehicles, robots, whatever you want to call them. I would point folk interested in this subject to a great article in The Economist this week on ground drone warfare. This article says there's about 40, mostly private Ukrainian firms right now producing around 200 separate, different types of ground drone, broadly grouped into 3 types, kind of logistics, delivering stuff, water, ammunition, also taking out wounded personnel. Then engineering support, mine laying and mine clearing. And then finally combat, although the combat drones are much fewer in number. They're much more technically, just moving the thing is one thing, actually targeting something is quite something else. But combat drones with grenade launchers or something to shoot down aerial drones, that kind of thing. So 3 sort of broad groups. Now, one of the manufacturers in the piece was quoted as saying, in spring, Ukraine announced plans to deploy 15,000 ground robots. And The Economist says some key players predict that this side of the war is going to change rapidly this summer. They're likening the proliferation of ground drones to that explosion of aerial drone manufacture and innovation of the last 18 months. One manufacturer said, we don't have the men to counteract Russia's meat wave, so we'll send our own zombies against theirs. Now, some are saying that this is the next area of innovation because Ukraine has to make up for the difference in manpower. And although ground drones are never going to totally replace infantry, it's thought that just a modest shift in the application of lethal military action on the ground, just a little shift can have real meaning in terms of not needing so many personnel. So the founder of one robotics firm says it will be a success if we replace 1% of our manpower needs on the front. And I think right now we can do quite a bit better than 1%. So emerging thoughts on an area that I think we're going to be talking a lot more about over the next, years, I guess, but worth having a look at that Economist article. We'll put a link in the episode notes. I think it is behind a paywall, but worth a look if you can get a glimpse.
Thanks very much, Dom. Well, James, I hope you've recovered from breach or reach. Where do you want to leave our listeners?
Yeah, I think I've recovered from breach or reach, a highly instructive parlour game. With, as you point out, Francis and Dom, this is no doubt why you brought it up, there is an underlying really serious aspect to this topic, which is, to use the boiling frog analogy, this is how Western officials fear that this sort of aggression would be slowly and insidiously introduced to an Eastern Baltic state like Estonia, or for that matter, Latvia or Lithuania. And I'll just end on this note. Many NATO officials, but particularly German officials, who have now got a permanent, I think, 5,000 strong troop deployment in Lithuania to police that border with Russia, have said that this could be something that happens within as little as the next 5 years, potentially, an attack on NATO's eastern flank to test to destruction, which is the point that Dom clearly was driving at earlier, of NATO Article 5. And so, at first sight, perhaps slightly whimsical story, if you read a story in the papers about nuns accused of being spies or something similar, but there is this quite legitimate and serious security background to it.
Sound of music.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.